السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وآله، ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار من تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. ثم أما بعد. It is a pleasure to be in this conference. It is unfortunate that I could not make it all the way to Lahore, but inshallah some other time I'll be more than honored to visit and to have the interaction face to face. It is difficult to connect via Zoom, but inshallah, since the hearts are at a certain level of connection, we will be able to connect, inshallah. I am pleased to be talking about this issue of AI, because as my brother mentioned, I do have a PhD in systems analysis and design. And the application that I applied, the systems theory that I worked on in my PhD, technical PhD, if you wish, was actually AI and neural networks technology and so on. That was back in the 90s. That's a long time ago. My brother mentioned that I teach Islamic law and so on. So that's my other studies that I did back in the UK, and eventually I became a professor of Islamic law. But I never forgot my AI fascination and AI days. Actually, one of the reasons I left the AI field and did not continue with this technical kind of career, which would have been perhaps a more stable career, one of the reasons is the dangers of AI and the questions of the application of AI. And early on, that's now, as I mentioned, 25, 30 years ago, when I worked in this field, we had issues with the way AI is developing. Because what is AI? You are actually working on mimicking the human intelligence, or interpreting the human intelligence in a particular way and trying to mimic it via machine, software or hardware, whether you're talking about robotics, etc., or you're talking about the software that is mimicking the data mining, etc. At that time, the applications of AI in universities, I was with the University of Waterloo in Canada, which is well known for its AI division. The Pattern Analysis and Machine Intelligence Lab is where I did my PhD, the lab that eventually produced BlackBerry and other Canadian technology. And the NASA space arm was developed partly in this lab in terms of pattern recognition and so on. So my point was that the applications of AI at that time were mostly geared towards military applications. And that is something that I found ethically and religiously, in terms of my Deen of Islam, not acceptable. Did not wish to participate in converting the killing of people into a more efficient killing of people, and killing machine that is killing people, whatever the politics are in this world. It doesn't help humanity for that killing machine to become faster and more efficient and more intelligent. And that was the departing point in terms of career-wise. As I mentioned, as a young man in my 20s at that time, career-wise, that I thought that this is not for me. AI, though, is much more dangerous than that now. As we move on with technology, it is not just smart weapons and more efficient killing, but is more efficient humanity in general. And it could be more efficient good things and could be more efficient evil things. It is quite a question whether we try to become more efficient and work on the technology before we define the purpose of the technology. My brothers asked me to talk about maqasid. And the first question, before I get into some details about the maqasid methodology, the first question of a maqasid approach is why? Like, what is the maqsid of AI? And the maqsid of AI, or the objective, the purpose, should go back and define our stance from AI. We cannot have a stance or a hukum or a fatwa or any of these partialistic views of AI as a technology without looking at the purpose of it. Why AI? And then we can look at the how and the what, and we can get into some details. But why AI is a very important question. And if why is more efficiency, the reason and the purpose of that efficiency has to be clear. More efficient of what? What is the operation that we become more efficient in? And that will have to connect AI as a branch of computer science, computer engineering, etc., with other branches of knowledge. We cannot separate the study of the phenomena of artificial intelligence from the studying of other phenomena that we have today. It is not possible to separate AI from the economics of AI, from the politics of AI, from the societal studies, the sociology, if you wish, of AI, from where AI is on a number of sciences and a number of approaches. The economics of AI is very important. You are developing all of these huge machines, software machines. How are you developing them financially speaking? And how are you covering your cost? And if the machines are being developed in order to mine large data, this large data, how is it covering its cost? Anything that we say or do today is somewhere stored. And now the breakthrough in storage capacities have caused like endless storage for those who would like to store information. And then you mine the information and you try to get basically the data that you are looking for. When you look at big data, you cannot separate this from the economics of it. The covering of the cost of what you are doing is actually the people that you are basically spying on. And this is how the economic model works. So you cannot just look at AI as, when we studied engineering, you put the engineer in a box and you give the engineer very little knowledge of economics or politics. And you might think that engineering has nothing to do with economics or politics. And it is all about economics and politics. But when you develop a machine, this is the guy who is developing the machine for you. But the machine is in what economic context and what political context? Now, the politics of it is not brighter than the economics of it. When you look at how the world is functioning in terms of the balance of powers and the question of violence, and you find that basically people with bigger guns are like just enforcing a status quo on the rest of the world, enforcing a value of a currency and enforcing certain states and certain systems. And just that's how it is, just simply a bigger gun. And our human politics is moving more and more from the social and the convincing arguments of politics into simply the equation of the means of violence, internally and externally. Look at the Arab world. Internally, that's what defines politics at the end. Who has a bigger gun and who has more thugs to terrorize the other? And in the world scene, it's a very similar view. So my point is, if you look at the context of AI economically and politically, then you are able to look at the connections of this phenomena to other places and to other phenomena. And perhaps then you can start to judge how you're going to study it. In the time allowed to me, I thought that I would get into an introduction of what we call in the Maqasid Institute, Maqasid methodology. It's something that we developed in order for researchers to study contemporary phenomena based on a particular methodology. And I noticed from the journey that I had, the academic journey, that some people would like to deal with contemporary phenomena in a wasati way, or let's say modernist kind of Islam way. And the wasatiyun, or the centrist school, if you wish, they tend to say that AI and these things and medical advancements and whatever it is, even the democratic tools, all of these are sciences that Islam does not object to. So the approach of approving any science that Islam doesn't reject, when the science, as long as the science is not asking you to drink alcohol or commit zina or do riba, like in the very clear sense and all of that, then any science is actually respectful and is something that Islam does not object to. That's one stream of Muslim thought since the early 20th century, Sheikh Muhammad Abdu and the school that developed into the Wasatiyya school. And then you have the Islamization of knowledge school, al-aqli wal-naqli kind of school, that says that Islam has to have both. So they, unfortunately, in the most part, defined an-naqli as the historical. So naqli means the books of fiqh, and Malik and Abu Hanifa and Shafi'i and what they did. And somehow this is supposed to mix with al-aqli, which is to the most part secular. So you are talking about a historical approach and a secular approach, and these people are supposed to sit together and produce knowledge. Somehow, I was involved in one of those experiments back in Doha, that's now 10 years ago. And I found from this experience that what is lacking is methodology, is a common approach between the aqli people and the naqli people, so that the aqli people are not just coming from a secular perspective, enforcing a positivist philosophy or whatever it is, economically, a Chicago school, or politically, a Machiavellian kind of approach, whatever it is that is not Islamic. And the naqli people do not enforce an imitation, a blind imitation kind of approach to Islam that is not going to help with the study of contemporary phenomena. So in order for those two sides to be able to talk, it is important to develop multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary scholars. It's important to go back to the encyclopedic and comprehensive nature of knowledge in Islam, and insist that the people who come to study contemporary phenomena come from an Islamic perspective. You really cannot come and study social justice from a Rawlsian perspective and claim to be Islamic, or study a sociological phenomena that that you classify as something that belongs to sociology, and you come from a Durkheim kind of approach. That is not Islamic. And yes, there is a difference between Islamic and non-Islamic because of the source of knowledge. What is truth when you want to study a phenomena like AI or study any other phenomena? What is truth? And how do you define that? Hence, this methodology that we're trying to propose starts with the source of truthful knowledge. I will summarize something that I wrote a book recently about, as my brother mentioned. I'll summarize quickly. Source of truthful knowledge has to be the revelation, has to be the revealed word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I will talk quickly about the logic, framework, and process. This is a humble book that I wrote recently to summarize this approach to knowledge from a maqasid perspective. so that the maqasid approach is no longer, hopefully, an apologetic approach for mischief that happens in the name of Islam that we see all over the world. In the name of the preservation of wealth, we justify every kind of theft, like the intellectual property international agreements, for example, or in the name of preservation of wealth, we justify riba as it is in Islam and so forth, or in the name of the preservation of mind or intellect, we justify some other crimes or some other sins because Islam is defined based on the maqasid. That is not what the maqasid approach is supposed to be. The maqasid approach is supposed to be a genuine approach. And when you come from the purposes of the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then you are not going to contradict what Islam is about, and you are going to try to build your own framework as you analyze issues. The source of truthful knowledge is that knowledge that came down to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam on that mountain, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. And this is serious because oftentimes people say that the Quran is not a book of history or economics or politics. And therefore, they say that we cannot really approach knowledge through that book because it doesn't have these equations and charts that we use in the different sciences. And of course, it doesn't, but it does have the information that reigns over that kind of knowledge. It does have the criterion muhaiminan alayhi, the haymana, the kind of ideas that give you the framework of how you think about things. The definition of Islam as a religion is not how Islam is religion in the Latin sense, a religio kind of pact of people who agree on certain rituals, something in your heart. That is the secular definition. And that's in the heart of the two approaches I mentioned in the beginning that you could label wasati or you could label Islamization of knowledge approaches. There is, in the heart of these approaches, is a secular approach to Islam, where you are dividing the religion from life, really. And you are saying that the Islamic knowledge is not applicable really to the basics of sciences. Might be applicable to some of the ethical behavior or ethical codes, might be applicable to some of the ritualistic things that you avoid, drinking alcohol and eating pork, but not applicable to the basics of the science. The basics of the science have to be coming from this truthful knowledge. It is essential that we connect any study of any phenomena to the bigger challenges that humanity has. We cannot really study AI without connecting it to its economic interests and objectives and political objectives and how the world is functioning today. Otherwise, we are developing a machine that we don't know what it's going to be used for. And it's better not to develop that machine. In my opinion, it is better not to develop that machine in general if the world is going to continue on that trajectory and the state is moving in that direction and international relations and economics is moving in that direction. The pandemic is uncovering a lot of the dynamics that's happening. People could die in Africa as long as the pharma companies are going to keep their intellectual property agreements so that they can make more and more billions. They could die and they could develop more dangerous viruses, no problem, because we are not going to let them vaccinate and we are not going to give them the technology, and we're not going to even allow them to build their own technology in order to be able to vaccinate their own people. And it's going to take them years, as the South Africans are saying now, in order to be able to develop the vaccine. If the pandemic is showing that picture of the international relations and how it's working, then developing a more efficient intelligence is going to be quite problematic. The framework that is proposed in study of phenomena. In the time allowed, inshallah, give very quick summarization of that. Has to do with a 7-element framework in approaching that phenomena that we have to build based on reflections upon the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger. Talked about objectives, which is the question of why. Why are you studying the phenomena, and why the phenomena? Why AI? And the objectives from the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have to be linked and discussed with the objectives of the science and the objectives of the technology that we are developing. So what the Quran calls al-islah and al-ifsad, the reform, the rectification, as well as the corruption. Where are the objectives in terms of the objectives of the Quran? Now, when you look at concepts and you look at AI, quite interesting. How do you define intelligence? That is the first concept that you need to look at, linked to the objectives. Intelligence in the AI sense is defined in a material way. Intelligence in the Quranic sense is defined differently. It's not al-dhaka. This is not a Quranic word, but it's basically al-aql. And al-aql or al-ilm or al-lub, the depth of your heart, not really your brain, because in Islam, consciousness is actually in your heart, not in your brain. And those who study AI and they get into a little bit of neuroscience in order to define consciousness, they realize that people in neurosciences don't even believe in consciousness, except for humans and in a particular way in the brain. It's a very chemical approach to consciousness. But consciousness in the Quran could be defined best as al-haya. And everything in that sense has haya, has life. And everything has a memory, even though we define memory from the neurosciences approach in terms of the chemicals of certain parts of the brain, but memory is much bigger than that, and consciousness. So the concept of consciousness has to be studied here. I'm not claiming to have studied the phenomena of AI from this perspective, but I'm just outlining how you can do that given this maqasid methodology. So you look at the basic concepts that define AI in terms of intelligence, and how are you going to define intelligence? When you look at values in terms of the values of harm and benefit, the values of ugliness and beauty as well, the different values, the moral values and so forth. How can the moral values connect with the objectives and concepts? How can the commands that we have in the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger connect with all of this? How can the universal laws, one of the universal laws, for example, is the al-fitra al-insaniyya, the human nature. How is the universal laws connected to all of these other elements of the framework as we analyze the framework? And how do you divide the groups? That division is very important, since AI apparently is making people divided into different layers and different groups, people who have the code and define the algorithms, really, and people who the algorithms apply for or apply on. And yes, it's more complex than that, but the definition of groups here is very important as you define the concepts and the objectives and so on, because there are different groups where different objectives apply and different values. And proofs here have to do with the logic, which experts of AI would know would be an essential part of designing AI, is the logic in the coding itself and so forth. The logic used to be the good old Greek syllogistic kind of simple relations in those old languages of logic programming. I understand that now the technology has developed a lot and the logic is more connected and more networked. That kind of logic is very close to the Islamic approach and the way the revelation is teaching us to think, yet it will require a lot of study in order to see how this networked approach could be a balanced approach, doesn't contradict with the universal laws of balance and connectivity and so forth. If you look at a process of studying this phenomena, you have to start with a purpose, again, the question of why, and then you go to the cycles of reflection amongst what we call the cycles of reflection here, Dawrat Tadabbur, in the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger, in order to be able to come up with this framework. This framework has to come from the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger, and then would judge a similar framework that is from the reality. So you have a framework that is based on your reflection upon the Quran and Sunnah, and you compare this, the objectives to the objectives, the values to the values, and the commands to the commands, and make the link. And you will have to go then to a stage of critical studies of the literature that we have so far. From the Islamic perspective, there is very few literature on the issue of AI and how we deal with it. And this conference is one of those attempts to solve this problem, but also critical studies of the other literature that is trying to deal with AI, for example, from an ethical perspective. And the issue is much bigger than the ethics. It's not just to update those laws that govern, robots, the old 60s and 70s simple algorithms in order to have an ethical robot kind of thing. No, you really have to look at the economics of it, the politics, and to look at AI as part of a bigger world and a connected world that it is going to serve. So the literature here is not just the AI literature or the ethics, engineering ethics literature, but basically the literature that is tied to this phenomena from every science and every approach. What we need here are formative theories and principles as kind of an outcome of this approach. And this is a very summarized outline of this methodology. But what we need are guidelines, not fatwas in that sense, because the fatwa has to do with something that is a particular action, mostly individual, that is haram, etc. And this is what the Majami' al-Fiqh, the fiqh councils work on. The phenomena of AI is much bigger than that. And I don't think Majami' al-Fiqh today, and I'm a member of a few of them, are qualified to deal with this because of the partialism in the approach itself. The approach is partialistic. And upgrading Majami' al-Fiqh into an ethical approach to Islam, I don't think would cut it as well, because the ethical approach will not take into account the bigger political and economic picture, which is the purpose of AI and is the factor that affects the judgment of this technology the most. And of course, if you go to the different details of AI, then you will look at different issues. But it's just an outline that I wanted to give in the time allowed for me in this conference, to look at the bigger questions and to connect and to go beyond the current approaches, the current methodologies. And this methodology has a lot of details. It's quite a lengthy book, but I wanted to just give an outline. I can see here a number of participants. Some of them are, dear brothers and sisters. I would like to give time, inshallah, for more discussion. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I see here, please put questions in the chat. We'll take more time. The recording will be shared. I'm not sure. I don't see discussions. I don't hear anything, actually. I'm not sure if anybody is with us online.
Can you hear, Sheikh?
I can hear you now,
Okay.
yes.
very interesting talk. Thank you very much. And I thank you again. We are indebted that you woke up early in the morning, and mashallah, may Allah Ta'ala accept your
Allah bless you.
effort. So our
It's
question
before
is,
Fajr here in Toronto.
this is like the end of the first day, and we have seen this that within, like you've mentioned, AI is now not just one thing, and we are all living in the world of AI to some extent. It is involved in all of the applications that we make use of. And there are certain applications like the killer robots, or maybe we would say that AI exists in a spectrum, and AI is not just one thing. The other thing is currently the discourse on AI ethics is very principles driven. It's non-holistic. So you are exactly the right person. Mashallah, you have the expertise in systems thinking and in holism and thinking about how different things connect. So my question is, keeping in mind that AI is such a complex thing, and your framework also appears to be a network of multiple entities weaved together. So can you tell us how this will help us in concrete settings on how to decide and how it will improve the state of practice? Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair. Well, I just comment on your statement, Akhi, that you're saying that AI is not just one thing. And yes, not everything are killer robots, but the way AI is used with data mining and large data or big data on the internet, for example, is quite dangerous, actually, because you are talking about yes, you're not talking about killer robots, but you are talking about soft bots that are gathering information on people. You know, I speak to a friend just orally like that, and then I find my phone throwing ads on me about what I spoke. You know, that's quite dangerous, actually, because if you look at the way governments are trying to deal with the world, I live in the West here, and we have issues with governments and the way they are dealing with the pandemic. When you look at that, you will see that this is not just about killer robots and automated tanks. It's also about what you could call in ethics privacy of people, but it's not just privacy, it's the rights, and it's the structure of their societies. AI is changing the structure of the society and the nature of governance. And governance is very dangerous, not just in the direct weapon sense, but also in the way people are governed based on these machines that are just more efficient. Now, how can this impact the day-to-day practice? Well, the day-to-day practice of an engineer is usually about programming a particular thing or fixing a certain part of a machine. But the engineer has to be aware of the bigger picture. And when you are aware of the bigger picture, then you are going to think locally or act locally or whatever, program locally in a way that has a wider consciousness. You are not just a part of a machine. You are not a screw in a bigger machine, and that is what an engineer is. And the day-to-day practice has to be informed by the bigger picture. And if you don't see that the bigger picture of what you are serving is ethical or is Islamic in that sense, then you don't continue with that. You try to use your genius and your technology in a different way. So the transformation of this into day-to-day, it would require research, but as a general guideline, you have to be aware of the bigger picture. I see some questions on the chat here. Do you think using systems thinking, capturing the whole, not the sum of the system, be able to capture the ethics and morality of AI? I think systems thinking is the most advanced way of thinking in secular academia that has to do with methodology. But I think we have to develop our own holistic and connected way from the Islamic perspective. When you read in systems philosophy, you will find that most of the systems philosophers are actually atheists. They don't come from any perspective of religion, let alone Islam. And that is quite problematic. And so, in other words, we need to develop our own systems philosophy from the Islamic perspective. And that perhaps is something that this Maqasid methodology is trying to contribute to, not claiming to be coming from a systems perspective. The book is explaining that we're coming from a Quranic perspective. Of course, you read the Quran with particular eyeglasses and particular lens and a particular way. Yes, there is no reading of the Quran that is away from the reader. It's true, but the Quran itself would be the guide of how you read it. And the hermeneutics of reading should not make us disbelieve in the ultimate truth of that book, and that there are things that it is telling us. It's not everything that we project on it. So in terms of systems thinking, we should be able to critique systems thinking as it deviates from the real holism and real connectivity, which is the connection with Al-Khaliq subhanahu wa ta'ala, the connection with the Creator, and the mission of the prophets, and the good for humanity, which is something that usual system thinking doesn't do. And systems philosophy just looks at the connectivity, but it doesn't really focus on the heart and the role of the heart in calculating or producing the whole from the sum of the parts. That whole that is bigger than the sum of the parts is going to emerge and is going to be understood by a heart. And that heart has to be a qalbun salim, has to be a pure heart. Otherwise, your systems thinking will lead you to more integrated thinking, but in an evil way and in a deviated way. So I do agree with the importance of systems thinking, but I'm calling for an Islamic approach that is wider than that. Another question, can you suggest some ways to embed the methodology in the curriculum to prepare individuals with the ability to think holistically? Yes, there is a whole chapter in that humble book on the conversion of Islamic scholarship based on this holistic methodology into curricula. And what I suggested there is to start with research, because we need a lot of research in the Islamic studies from a holistic, connected point of view. And from the research, we can develop the curricula that are needed. So far, we cannot develop the curriculum without doing the research. I believe that we need a lot of research that should be done. In the Maqasid Institute, we do have a number of research groups. One of them is actually studying AI as a phenomenon. I see here Dr. Ildus Rafiqov, who is the deputy director of the Maqasid Institute, and he is leading this group that's studying AI as a phenomenon. He will be speaking tomorrow. And we have other groups that's trying to produce research from the Maqasid methodology perspective, as you mentioned, the holistic research, so that we can embed the methodology in the curricula. But before we develop the research, it's not possible to develop Islamic curricula that are comprehensive and holistic. Thank you. We cannot skip AI research because we are not bold decision maker. You're not a bold decision maker as myself. I'm not a decision maker. I'm just a student of knowledge and just saying what I believe my research is leading me to. Shall we skip AI research and shall we work for driving it the right way? Oh, that's a very important question. Should we abandon AI as I did in my youth, as I mentioned? No, I don't think he should. I don't think he should. Had I found an Islamic approach to AI when I was teaching artificial intelligence in University of Waterloo, in the good old days, had I found somebody who would guide me to an Islamic approach that would make me approach this issue from an Islamic perspective. Not just to tell me that this is science and Islam is not against science, and not just to tell me to be an ethical engineer and honest and so forth. This is all good, but we need more than that. So what I'm saying, I'm suggesting is that no, do not leave AI, do not change careers, continue with what you're doing, but look for a methodology that is going to allow you to approach AI from an Islamic perspective, a genuine Islamic perspective, not just a partialistic perspective or a ethical perspective in the narrow sense. Ethical perspective in the wider sense is what you need in order for you to approach AI. And be more than happy to participate in our AI research group in the Maqasid Institute.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Jasser Auda, this is Amana.
Oh, mashallah. Dr. Amana, how are you?
So happy for you to be here with us today. And it just reminds me of those days when you examined my thesis. And I could never imagine then that we would have been discussing AI 10 years down the line.
My honor.
I have actually two comments or questions. One pertaining to what you just said in answer to the student's question as to whether they should be pursuing career in AI or not. And you said that no, they should, but still be on the lookout. But do you think this is practically possible? Because again, this would be disheartening since the very holistic framework that you discussed just now wouldn't allow individuals to just do this within the silos the way academia happens these days, unless we have a very consolidated Muslim network, and just one Maqasid Institute, I believe, is not enough for that. So if we give such, because a lot of my students also ask me for such advices, bit telling them that you should be doing something, and then when they're unable to do that, actually makes them more pessimistic. That's one thing. The other thing relates to what you said earlier regarding systems philosophy and systems philosophers and thinkers who are atheistic in their leanings, and that we need to sort of fix that through our Islamic lens. So we had a talk, I think in the afternoon, yes. So Mufti Abdul Khaliq was telling us about Shah Waliullah's philosophy and how we can collaborate with other philosophies and outlooks as long as they are not directly in contradiction to our basic foundations and values, especially because AI is something, although I'm a firm believer in localization, even engineering has to be local according to the needs of a given local community. But that's a far goal. That's far away. Right now, we are all global players. Everything's happening in a globalized world. And so again, this seems to me to be something that's almost inevitable, to partner with those people who are at least thinking holistically, even if not from a theistic perspective. I would like to know your opinion on that. Jazakallah khair.
Allah bless you. Allah bless you. It's great to meet with you, Doctora, albeit online, inshallah. First, yes, you have to look at the economics of it. Yes, it's not possible to work in academia if you take a purely religious approach as Islamic approach, but some academic sectors allow that. Usually not mainstream academia, but sometimes it's allowed to have a confessional approach to Islam rather than a secular approach to Islam. You have to look at the economics of it if you're going to open a company. Perhaps we should look at awqaf, and that's something we're trying to promote in the Maqasid Institute, that it's not possible to create independent Islamic scholarship without the awqaf side, without people donating for an endowment that is going to spend on the research or the education. Because if you don't have an endowment, then the education is either a business that goes with the needs of the market and the bottom line of the business person who is supporting it, or it's going to be under a government and therefore also goes of the bottom line of the governments and the politics of it. In order for your education or research to be independent, it is important to look at al-awqaf, or the endowments, Islamic endowments, as an approach to the economics of AI. So these students who ask this question, I would advise, yes, continue your AI, but perhaps build an NGO through which you can do your AI work. So you are independent of the bad economics of it. You can go and work in the big corporations, but you will see from the big corporations that there are many, many ethical issues if you take from an Islamic point of view. But if you develop your own economic model of working in AI, perhaps this would be my advice. The second point is, yes, we partner with everybody. We partner with atheists and whatever. But what is the common ground? There is a myth that is quite popular these days that secularism is a common ground. So I live in the West here. So when we deal with people, let's assume that we're all secularists. And let's assume this as a common ground. But secularism is another religion. It's not a common ground. And is there a common ground? Yes, but it's a case by case and aspect by aspect. So we could have a cooperation based on the fact that we both reject the lack of privacy, for example, in some AI technology. And we fight against the breaching of privacy, for example. That's aspect by aspect, but not to cooperate based on that religion is a bias, because that is by itself a bias. Islam is a common ground. Allah is telling the people of the book, come to the common word that we worship none but Allah. You don't agree to this as a common word, that is your issue. But we cooperate then on a case by case and aspect by aspect, rather than a general blanket of cooperation. And we find ourselves as Muslims being used for the agenda of more powerful people. So that's, inshallah, a quick answer of that.